Welcome back to my channel. I'm Neil Chase, author of Iron Dogs and writer-director of Spin the Wheel. Today let's talk about supernatural horror. It's one of the most chilling and immersive genres out there, but it's also tricky to get right. Today we're going to look at 5 common mistakes writers make when writing supernatural horror and how to avoid them. So grab your popcorn, let's get started. First off, let's answer the question, what is supernatural horror? Well, it's that subgenre of horror where fear comes from forces beyond human understanding. Ghosts, demons, cursed objects, eldritch entities, you name it. Unlike psychological horror, which plays on internal fears, supernatural horror introduces otherworldly elements that defy logic and reason, usually creating an eerie or unsettling atmosphere. So instead of a serial killer or a virus, think of a werewolf or a cursed doll. Something rooted in magic or fantasy rather than science or reality. Less Hannibal Lecter and more Count Dracula. So now that we have a basic grasp of the genre, let's look at the 5 biggest mistakes writers make when writing this kind of horror, and more importantly, how to get it right. The first mistake writers make is explaining too much. One of the biggest killers of supernatural horror is over-explaining. When you reveal too much about the entity or curse or haunted location, and I'm talking about backstory or mechanics, or simply how it came to be. You strip away the fear of the unknown. Horror thrives on mystery, especially when it comes to the supernatural. Not knowing why it happens makes it infinitely more unsettling than having a logical explanation for every little thing. Simply put, the moment the audience understands everything about it, it stops being scary. For an example of this mistake, look at Insidious: The Last Key. It over-explains Keyface, the supernatural entity at the heart of the story, revealing a detailed backstory that makes the horror feel less mysterious and more predictable. The more we learn about this demonic force and its past, the less it feels like an unstoppable force and more like a character with specific limitations. And the more information we're given, the more it weakens that fear factor. This is something we see often with sequels or remakes, where the mystery is worn off to such a degree that the villain or the creature simply stops being scary. And to compensate, the writers try to explain every little detail in order to keep the audience engaged. So what's the solution? Well, leave room for mystery. A great horror story gives just enough information to keep the audience intrigued, but doesn't spell everything out. The Blair Witch Project is a great example. It gives just enough backstory to create intrigue, but never fully explains the entity. In fact, it barely explains anything at all, keeping the viewer as much off balance as the protagonists. Not only does it deepen the mystery of what's happening and how to escape, but it keeps the fear alive in the viewer's imagination. Unanswered questions are way more unsettling than a complete explanation. Another mistake writers make is ignoring the atmosphere. I mean, atmosphere is everything in supernatural horror. It's not just about the ghost or demon, it's about the world that entity and the hero live in. It's a blend of real life with the unknowable darkness of some otherworldly realm or presence that makes the audience feel uneasy. A good horror story, especially one rooted in the supernatural, needs to use setting, light, sound, tone, style, and pacing to build suspense. The film Winchester is a good example of this mistake. It had an interesting premise, a seemingly never-ending haunted house with too many rooms and passageways leading nowhere in order to trap and confuse the malevolent spirits within. But instead of focusing on mood and tension to deliver on the psychological side of the story's premise, it relies too much on jump scares, losing that eerie atmosphere. The film has a rich historical setting that could have been used to create a sense of deep, lingering dread, but it mostly wastes that potential by rushing into loud, predictable scares instead. So what's the solution? Well, build dread by focusing on what we can see and can't see, on what we can hear, and on the pace that the story character's world unravels in an incomprehensible and horrific way. The Others is a fantastic example of this. The film is filled with quiet tension, dim lighting, and a constant feeling of unease that makes the supernatural elements feel truly terrifying. Shadows stretch unnaturally, whispers seem to come from nowhere, and every creaking floorboard builds anticipation rather than providing some immediate payoff. Remember, building tension in a story is like building pressure in a boiler. You want to take it as far as you can before it explodes, and then release just enough to make your audience take a breath. before you ramp it up again. Our next mistake is making characters act unrealistically. Nothing pulls an audience out of a horror story faster than characters making nonsensical decisions just to keep the plot moving. I mean, we've all seen this. Characters going into a dark basement, or staying in the haunted room, or wandering off alone. Stupid decisions made because the plot needs them to, and not because any sane or rational person would ever do so willingly. If the characters don't act logically, the audience won't stay emotionally invested. They'll just get pissed off that you wrote idiots instead of believable characters. As an example of this mistake, The Devil Inside has characters making baffling choices like investigating multiple dangerous supernatural forces without taking any logical precautions, even down to priests performing unsanctioned exorcisms and allowing the main characters to attend just because. They enter situations unprepared, armed only with a camera to document possessions guerrilla style. They ignore obvious warning signs and shrug off demonic threats and actual attacks, always returning for more abuse, and generally acting in ways that real people wouldn't, making it hard to care about their fate. An audience might forgive one or two illogical actions, but a story filled with them will only make your characters more hateable, rather than being sympathetic. So what's the solution? Keep character actions believable within the supernatural context. In The Conjuring, the Warrens are professional paranormal investigators who approach the supernatural with logic and experience, making their choices feel grounded even in a fantastical setting. For example, when they figure out that demonic possession is the problem, they try to get the church to perform an exorcism. But it'll take too long to get approval since the victim isn't Catholic, forcing the Warrens to attempt it themselves. So even when they're faced with terrifying events, their reactions feel appropriate, and their strategies for dealing with hauntings make sense. Our next mistake is failing to build tension before the horror strikes. Tension is the backbone of supernatural horror. If the threat appears too soon and without proper buildup, the fear doesn't have time to take root. Horror is the most effective when it allows audiences to anticipate and dread what's coming before the horror is fully revealed. In this way, the viewer or reader becomes a participant instead of just a casual observer. For an example of this mistake, look at the film Darkness Falls. Following a quick preamble showing the origin of the Tooth Fairy, it introduces the main villain almost immediately, along with listing all the ways to fend her off. And because it happens so quickly, the story doesn't allow enough time for either the characters or the audience to develop anticipation or dread. They already know what's coming to get them, and why, and even how to stop it. All that's left is going through the motions until it happens, making the horror feel rushed and way less effective than it could be. So what's the solution? Let the tension simmer before unleashing the horror, with a mix of slow-building dread, misdirection, and mystery. The Exorcist does this perfectly, spending much of its runtime on establishing the story world, the characters, and eerie disturbances before revealing the full horror of Regan's demonic possession. And even then, it doesn't spell out exactly what entity the priests are dealing with, making their task even harder and more dangerous. The supernatural threat feels inevitable and terrifying. This gradual buildup ensures that each time terror does strike, it has maximum impact, growing in intensity with each encounter and leaving a lasting impression. The horror isn't just about what jumps out at you, it's about what you think might be lurking just out of sight. And the final mistake is not having rules for your supernatural entity. Even though the story isn't rooted in our real world of logic and science, supernatural horror still needs its own internal logic and rules. If your entity or curse or object or location can do anything at any time, it stops feeling scary and starts feeling random. A lack of clear rules makes it impossible for the characters, and by extension the audience, to understand what's truly at stake. For an example of this mistake, look at Slender Man. It features a monster with inconsistent properties. Sometimes it teleports, sometimes it manipulates minds, sometimes it just lurks in the background. Its power set and limitations are never really established, and dealing with such a story can become frustrating for the audience. The lack of clear rules makes it less menacing because there's no way to predict what it can or can't do, making its actions feel more arbitrary rather than scary. And it also makes the odds of stopping it virtually impossible. This is one of the ways supernatural horror differs from cosmic horror, which leans into the inevitability of the monster winning, mainly because it is so godlike that it can do anything. What grounds supernatural horror is that more often than not, there is a chance, albeit a slim one, for the protagonist to come out on top. But that can only happen with clearly defined rules that the writer must follow. So what's the solution? Establish clear rules and limitations for your supernatural threat. It Follows does this really well. The entity always follows its victims at a walking pace, never trying to hide or jump out of shadows. It's just there, always moving forward, making its presence relentless yet predictable, which increases the tension rather than reducing it. The knowledge that it will never stop and the consistency of its behavior forces the characters to think strategically about how to survive, which means they have to rely more on their own skills and brains than on blind luck. And that adds to both the overall suspense and the terror it instills. And at the end of it all, that's the name of the game. Scaring your audience in a clever and grounded way, even in a supernatural story world where anything can happen. Remember, mastering supernatural horror requires balance, maintaining mystery while revealing just enough, building atmosphere instead of relying on cheap scares, writing realistic characters who behave like actual people, building tension without giving away too much right away, and ensuring your supernatural threat has clear, consistent rules. By avoiding these common mistakes, you can create a terrifying and immersive horror experience that puts your audience in the middle of the action instead of running away from it. But hey, these are just my 2 cents. Give me yours. Let me know in the comments below. Can you think of any other supernatural horror mistakes that you've seen in movies or books? And how would you fix them? And if you're looking for a couple of stories centered around the supernatural, then you'll love my horror novel Iron Dogs and my thriller film Spin the Wheel, out now on Tubi. You can find the links for both below. And if you're looking for help with your own story, contact me on my webpage, neilchasefilm.com, through the link below, and let's talk. I've helped writers, filmmakers, and producers take their stories and scripts to the next level. And if you'd like more unique storytelling tips that take your fiction to the next level, click that like button, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell to stay updated with the latest content. Until next time, stay creative.